The salt spray stung Hank's eyes, a familiar burn that he welcomed more than the stale air of the homeless shelter. He sat on the seawall, his gaze fixed on the churning gray of the Atlantic, a vast emptiness that mirrored his own. At 43, Hank's body was a roadmap of faded bruises and sharp angles. The once powerful frame of a Navy SEAL, honed for a decade of the world's most dangerous missions, was now gaunt, his muscles atrophied from months of poor nutrition and the slow, gnawing poison of despair. His sea bag, the same one that had accompanied him from BUD/S training to deployments in Fallujah and the Hindu Kush, sat beside him, its contents reduced to a few worn T-shirts, a faded photograph, and his last $200 in cash. The story was as old as it was cruel. After his final tour, the transition to civilian life had been a brutal, disorienting freefall. The brotherhood, the mission, the clarity of purpose, all of it was gone, replaced by the static hum of a world that didn't understand him and a job market that had no use for his particular skill set. He'd drifted through security jobs, construction, and long, lonely nights where the silence was louder than any firefight. The marriage that had survived his deployments couldn't survive the man who came home. Then came the diagnosis from the VA, a constellation of physical ailments from old injuries and the heavy, unshakable weight of PTSD. The disability payments were a pittance, and the part-time work he could manage barely covered the cost of a rented room. When that last room slipped away, the streets of Norfolk became his new unforgiving AO, and he was pulled from his grim reverie by a scuffling sound. A small, scruffy dog had materialized from behind a trash can, its coat a matted tangle of brown and black. It was a pit bull mix of some kind, with one floppy ear and eyes that held a depth of weariness that Hank recognized. The dog was sniffing at his sea bag, its ribs clearly visible beneath its dirty fur. It looked up at Hank, not with fear or aggression, but with a quiet, desperate plea. Hank didn't move. He knew better than to make sudden movements around a stray. "Hey there, little buddy," he murmured, his voice rusty from disuse. The dog's tail gave a single hesitant thump against the concrete. Hank slowly reached into his bag and pulled out the last thing he had to eat, a slightly squashed peanut butter sandwich he'd gotten from a food kitchen earlier. Then he broke off a piece and tossed it gently. The dog snatched it up in a single gulp, then looked back at Hank, its eyes now shining with a different kind of plea. For the next hour, man and dog sat together in a silent truce against the cold. Hank didn't shoo it away, and the dog didn't leave his side. When Hank finally stood up, his joints aching, the dog stood with him. He started walking toward the shelter, hoping to get a bed for the night. The dog followed. Hank stopped and turned. "You can't come with me, buddy. They won't let you in." The dog just sat down, looking up at him as if to say, "Then don't go." Hank sighed, a long, shuddering exhale. It was just another responsibility he couldn't handle. But as he looked into those weary, intelligent eyes, he saw a reflection of his own solitude. "All right," he said, and the words feeling strange and foreign. "All right, but we're not going to the shelter." They spent the night huddled in the alcove of a shuttered bookstore, Hank's back against the cold stone, the dog curled into a tight, warm ball against his side. For the first time in months, Hank slept without a nightmare. The dog's steady heartbeat and warm fur seemed to form a fragile barrier against the phantoms that usually haunted him. He woke up stiff but with a strange, unfamiliar feeling in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it. It was purpose. He had to find food for the dog. He had to find a safer place for them to sleep. The mission, for the first time in years, was simply to survive, and it was a mission he now shared. He named the dog Scout, after the loyal reconnaissance men who moved silently ahead of the main force. It fit. And over the next few days, Hank and Scout became a familiar sight on the streets. Hank would panhandle near the waterfront, and Scout would lie patiently at his feet, his presence making people more willing to drop $1 or two into Hank's old cap. They shared everything: a burger from a fast food dumpster, a cup of coffee Hank managed to buy, the thin blanket he'd found in a dumpster. It was a miserable existence, but it was no longer a solitary one. Scout gave him a reason to get up, a reason to navigate the social services maze for a free meal, a reason to protect something other than his own broken self. Then, the letter came. Hank never got mail. He had no address. But a volunteer at the day center, a kind woman named Sarah who had taken a liking to the quiet, courteous man and his well-behaved dog, had recognized his name on a piece of official-looking mail that had been sitting at the shelter's front desk for weeks. It was from a lawyer in a small town called Westbrook, over 100 miles away in the western part of the state. With a sense of surreal disbelief, Hank tore it open. The letter was formal, dry, and utterly world-altering. It informed him that his great-aunt, Margaret Whitmore, had passed away 3 months prior. She was his paternal grandmother's sister, a woman he had met only once as a very young child. He had only the foggiest memory of a large old house filled with the smell of lavender and dust. According to the letter, she had died without a will, and as her last surviving relative, the entirety of her estate now passed to him. The estate included a property known as the Pines, a deserted mansion on the outskirts of Westbrook. Hank read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling. Scout, sensing his agitation, whined softly and nudged his hand. A mansion. He, a homeless man sleeping in doorways, had inherited a mansion. It felt like a cruel joke, a fragment of a delusion. He showed the letter to Sarah. She read it, her eyes widening, then broke into a wide smile. "Hank," she said, her voice full of wonder, "this is it. This is your way out." The bus ride to Westbrook was a journey into another world. The grime and noise of the city gave way to rolling green hills, dense forests, and small, tidy towns. Scout sat obediently on the floor of the bus, his head resting on Hank's knee. Hank's mind was a whirlwind of fragile hope and deep-seated skepticism. What would he find? A crumbling shack? A mountain of debt? And perhaps the whole thing was a mistake. Westbrook was a postcard of New England charm, with a white-steepled church, a single main street lined with small shops, and a general store where the locals eyed him and his dog with open curiosity. The lawyer's office was above a hardware store. Mr. Bellwether, a man with a kind face and a tweed jacket, shook his hand warmly, not seeming to notice or care about Hank's worn-out appearance. He explained the situation further. The property was substantial, over 10 acres of land, including forest and a private pond. The house itself was old, built in the 1920s, and had been vacant for nearly a year since his aunt's passing. There was no debt. In fact, there was a small savings account that would cover the immediate back taxes and some initial expenses. "The place is in a state of neglect, mister." "Hey, Bradley," Bellwether cautioned, handing him a large, old-fashioned iron key. "It will need a lot of work, but the bones are good. It's a solid house." Hank took the key. It felt impossibly heavy in his hand. It was a key to a door, a home, a future he had stopped believing in. "Thank you," was all he could manage. The road to the Pines wound uphill, away from the town center, and was lined with towering old maple and oak trees, their branches creating a cathedral-like canopy. The house, when it finally came into view, was both magnificent and melancholic. It was a grand 3-story colonial revival, painted a faded gray with a wide wraparound porch, tall, shuttered windows, and a large cupola-topped barn at the back of the property. Weeds and wildflowers choked the front lawn, and a few shutters hung at a drunken angle. But the house itself stood proud and enduring. Hank stood at the end of the long gravel driveway, Scout by his side, just staring. He felt like an intruder, a ghost at his own gate. He walked up the creaking steps to the front door, the paint peeling in long, dry strips. The key turned in the lock with a heavy, satisfying clunk. The door swung inward, revealing a dim, cavernous foyer. The air was thick with dust and the scent of age, old wood, mothballs, and dried flowers. A grand staircase curved up into the shadows. Dust sheets covered the furniture in the adjoining living room, making them look like huddled ghosts. It was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock that, impossibly, was still keeping time. For Hank, it was overwhelming. It wasn't just a house. It was a legacy, a history, a life he knew nothing about. He wandered from room to room in a daze, a parlor filled with books, a formal dining room with a crystal chandelier draped in cobwebs, a cavernous kitchen with a vintage stove. Scout, however, was not interested in the grandeur. His nose was working overtime, twitching and sniffing at the baseboards, the door frames, the draft that came from under the staircase. His claws clicked a steady rhythm on the hardwood floors as he explored, his focus intense and singular. He was a working dog, and he had picked up a scent. He led Hank down a narrow hallway that branched off from the kitchen, past a pantry and a mudroom, to a heavy wooden door that Hank assumed led to a cellar. The door was old and warped, and it took a shove from his shoulder to get it open. A set of rough stone steps descended into inky blackness. The air that wafted up was cold and smelled of damp earth and very old stone. Hank peered into the darkness. He had no flashlight. Probably just a root cellar, he muttered to himself, not wanting to venture into the unknown without light. He started to pull the door shut, but Scout had other ideas. He slipped past Hank's legs and disappeared down the steps into the pitch black. "Scout! No, get back here!" Hank's voice echoed in the void. A wave of cold fear washed over him, not for himself, but for his dog. What if there was a hole? Old machinery? He fumbled in his pocket for his cheap plastic lighter. Clicking it on, the tiny flame did little to pierce the dark, but it was enough to start his descent. The steps were worn and slick with moisture. The air grew colder and heavier. The lighter flame flickered wildly, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the stone walls. He could hear Scout ahead of him, his nails scratching on stone, his breath an eager pant. The stairwell opened into a large, low-ceilinged cellar. The light from his lighter was pitiful, revealing only small pockets of the space, the curve of a massive stone foundation wall, a thick wooden beam, the glint of an old glass jar on a shelf. "Scout, where are you?" Hank whispered, his voice swallowed by the immense silence. Then he heard it. A frantic, insistent scrabbling sound from the far end of the cellar. He moved towards it, his heart hammering against his ribs. The flame on his lighter sputtered and died, the metal too hot to hold. He was plunged into absolute suffocating blackness. For a long, terrifying moment, he was blind. He was back in an operation, in a cave, in the dark, but the unknown all around him. He fought down the panic, forcing himself to breathe slowly, evenly. He was a seal. The dark was just another environment. He stood still, listening. Scout's scrabbling continued, a focused, purposeful sound. It wasn't the sound of an animal in distress, it was the sound of an animal trying to get to something. Hank dropped to his hands and knees and crawled forward, his hands sweeping the cold stone floor in front of him. He felt the rough texture of old bricks, the sharp edge of a broken bottle, and then metal. A heavy iron ring set flush into a stone flag. He followed the sound. Scout was right next to him now, his body wriggling with excitement. Hank's fingers traced the outline of a large, square stone, different from the others around it. The iron ring was set into it. He grasped it and took a deep breath and pulled. The stone didn't move. He braced his feet, summoned the last of his diminished strength, and pulled again, a low grunt escaping his lips. With a terrible grating sound that echoed in the darkness, the stone slab began to lift. A rush of even colder, drier air hit his face. He managed to slide the heavy stone aside, revealing a dark cavity below. It was a hidden compartment, a small, dry vault beneath the cellar floor. He reached his hand down into the void. His fingers first touched rough cloth, canvas or burlap, then the smooth, unmistakable shape of a leather-bound book. He pulled it out. Then another, smaller box, made of wood, intricately carved. He piled them on the cellar floor beside him. Scout nudged his hand, then licked his face, his tail thumping a happy rhythm against the stone. And Hank sat there in the profound darkness of the cellar, his dog beside him, and the cool, dry weight of the objects in his lap. He had no idea what they were. They could be worthless junk. But in the pitch black, with Scout's warm body pressed against him, they felt like more than just objects. They felt like answers. They felt like a connection to the woman whose house he now stood in. They felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a tangible piece of a destiny he was only just beginning to believe in. The darkness didn't seem so frightening anymore. He had his dog, he had a house, and now he had a mystery. The first faint embers of a new kind of mission were beginning to glow in his chest.